Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The day my Uncle Rick opened his mouth at the family barbecue and spat that line again, I swear I felt the heat from the grill rise 10 degrees hotter. It wasn't even directed at me at first. He was standing with a beer in one hand, spatula in the other, bragging about how nobody builds anything real anymore, tossing burgers like they were ideas, flipping them high so the grease popped and hissed in protest. He always spoke too loud, like the volume of his voice could beat you into agreeing. "You know what's wrong with this generation?" he bellowed to my cousin Todd, who nodded like a nervous deer. "Everyone wants to sit behind a screen and push buttons all day. Nobody gets their damn hands dirty anymore. Real men build real things." That was his favorite line. His battle cry. His tattooed-on philosophy. Real men build real things. I heard it when I was 12 and told him I wanted to design video games. I heard it when I was 16 and got my first job fixing laptops out of my bedroom. I heard it when I was 22 and launched my first app, which, according to him, was just digital masturbation. His words, not mine. Uncle Rick believed in steel, in sweat, in calluses and grit, and punching your time card with pride. And if you didn't match his blueprint for masculinity, you weren't worth the dirt under his boots. That afternoon, I was leaning against the deck railing, sipping a Coke, trying to blend into the background. I'd learned to do that early on. Rick was the type of guy who needed a stage, and the rest of us were there just to clap. He finally turned toward me, as he always did, when the beer hit that sweet spot between confidence and cruelty. "There he is," Rick said, pointing his spatula at me like it was a damn sword. "Mr. Tech Wizard himself. Tell me, Mason, how's that little app of yours? Still stealing people's data and selling it to the Chinese?" He laughed before I could even open my mouth. My Aunt Cheryl forced a chuckle and looked away. My mom shot me a glance that said, "Just smile, let it go." But I didn't smile. "It's doing all right," I said, voice even, staring directly at him. "We just closed Series C funding. Valuations north of 900 million. Rick blinked like I'd spoken another language. 900 what? Million, I repeated, casually taking another sip. He snorted and turned to the others. "See what I mean? These numbers don't even make sense. What does a million mean if it ain't backed by something you can touch? A machine, a truck, a factory floor? It's all fake. Monopoly money." I could feel the old shame rise in me like steam, hot, invisible, but choking. For years I let that shame drive me. Not fear of failure. Fear of him being right. Fear that maybe my world of code and cloud and commerce wasn't real enough to count. That maybe I was still that skinny kid with thick glasses who cried when Rick smashed his first desktop computer in a fit of rage because it wasn't doing what a man's tool should do. That was back when I was 8. He said real tools don't crash and threw it off the porch. I remember the sound of the glass shattering. I remember thinking I could fix it if I just had enough time. Rick circled back, burger now in hand, like he needed the final word. "Just remember," he said, smiling like a wolf, "when the grid goes down, people won't need apps. They'll need welders." Everyone laughed, except me. I looked at him, calm as hell, and said, "You'll see." It was the way I said it that made him pause, just for a second. I didn't say it like a threat or like some wounded nerd finally growing a spine. I said it like I already knew something he didn't, because I did. The truth was, I had known for nearly a year that his factory's lease was up soon. And I knew the company that owned the property was getting ready to sell. It wasn't public yet, but I had contacts. One of them had tipped me off that the land would go on the market quietly, likely to avoid union pushback. Rick had no idea. That's the thing about guys like him. They spend so much time barking orders, they never stop to notice who's quietly buying the leash. You ever notice how people like Rick don't talk to you, they talk at you? They don't argue, they declare. They don't ask questions, they just tell you how things are. And if you don't agree, they turn up the volume until you either nod or walk away. For a long time, I nodded. But I never walked away. I went to school on scholarships, took side gigs nobody wanted, coded at night until my fingers felt like stone. I didn't chase investors, I cornered them. I didn't launch a company, I built a goddamn war machine. One click at a time. But that day on that deck, I just smiled and took another sip of my Coke. No one noticed how my hand wasn't shaking. Because I wasn't mad anymore. I wasn't the kid begging to be taken seriously. I wasn't the teenager who cried when Rick told me real men don't type for a living. I was the man who just circled the date in red. And that date was coming. Soon. The thing about success stories that people love to share at conferences and TED Talks is that they always sound like polished marble, smooth, symmetrical, shining in the right light. But nobody ever tells you about the years you spend scraping mold off the underside just to breathe. My story didn't begin in some glossy startup incubator or a dorm room filled with pizza boxes and whiteboards covered in equations. It began in the backseat of a rusted-out Nissan that smelled like spilled coffee and desperation, parked behind a 24-hour gym where I pretended to work out just so I could use the showers and brush my teeth like a human being. Back then, I was 24, broke, and either too stupid or too stubborn to quit. I had a laptop with a cracked screen, a prepaid phone with 50 minutes a month, and a fire in my gut so bright it kept me warm when the nights dipped below freezing. I spent every dollar I had on data plans and cheap ramen, typing until my wrists throbbed, building lines of code that nobody saw and fewer people cared about. But I wasn't writing apps to impress girls or get likes. I was building something bigger, something I believed could shake the bones of the shipping industry if I got it right. A logistics platform designed to cut the fat out of last-mile delivery. That's what I worked on while people like Rick screamed about real work and real tools and how the world was going soft. You know what I've learned? You don't win by yelling louder. You win by staying quiet long enough to notice the gaps, the holes that loud men miss, because they're too busy filling the room with their own noise. So I watched. I watched warehouses lose shipments because no one knew where anything was once it left the dock. I watched freight companies bleed out over inefficient routing. I watched small business owners scream into the void because their customers blamed them when packages showed up late. And I took all of that rage, all of that disorder, and I wrapped it in code. I made it make sense. It took me 2 years, 3 laptops, and enough caffeine to pickle my kidneys, but I finally launched the first version. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. And it got noticed. Right before the pandemic hit, I signed my first pilot program with a regional delivery company in Texas. 3 weeks later, COVID scrambled the planet like an egg. Everyone was stuck at home, terrified, ordering everything from dog food to dumbbells online. Suddenly, logistics became king, and my little platform that once got laughed out of venture meetings was now the only thing keeping small freight operators afloat. We scaled fast, too fast maybe, but I didn't sleep. I just hired smarter people and got out of their way. We grew 200% in 6 months. By the end of year 1, we were handling 10 million transactions a day across 9 countries. And yes, I was coding for 20 hours a week, every single day. That's over 140 hours a month. Eventually, we rebranded, launched an AI integration, and suddenly we weren't a scrappy startup anymore. We were a contender. People began using words like disruptor and visionary around me, which felt weird because most days I still felt like a guy who once cried into his steering wheel outside of a laundromat because his code wouldn't compile. But through all of it, I never said a word to Rick. Not when we hit our first million in ARR. Not when we got featured in Forbes. Not when we landed a Department of Defense contract that made my mom's jaw drop. I played it quiet because I knew something loud men never understand. Real power doesn't need applause. Then, one afternoon, I was at a real estate mixer. Don't ask, long story, talking to this older guy who handled industrial properties in the area. He mentioned, casually, that one of the older manufacturing facilities just outside town was being prepped for sale. The owner, some crusty dinosaur, had failed to negotiate a long-term lease, and now the investment group wanted out. Too much liability, too many environmental headaches. My heart started to pound before I even asked. "Which facility?" I said, trying not to sound interested. He gave me a name. I already knew it. Rick's factory. The place he bragged about every Thanksgiving, every birthday party, every Sunday afternoon when he was 3 beers deep and ready to tell me again that screens don't build America. And, just like that, everything I'd worked for found a new shape. It wasn't about the app anymore. It wasn't even about the money. It was about that goddamn factory. The land was for sale. And I didn't hesitate. "Buy it," I said to my lawyer the next morning, quietly. He raised an eyebrow. "You sure? This place is kind of a dump." I looked him dead in the eye. Exactly. Because the thing Rick never understood, and what he still doesn't know, is that while he was yelling, I was listening. While he was pounding his chest, I was planting seeds. And now, those seeds were ready to bloom. In the soil he thought he owned. But didn't. Not anymore. When I first stood on that cracked patch of land, where the weeds broke through the concrete like rebellion, I didn't feel what I thought I would feel. There was no symphony playing in my head, no grand sense of triumph swelling in my chest like the final scene of a revenge movie. Just silence. And wind. And the faint metallic stink of oil baked into the dirt from 30 years of machines leaking their last breath. The factory loomed in front of me, Rick's factory, though technically it wasn't his anymore. Not in the way that mattered. He was still inside, I imagined, stomping around with that damn clipboard, barking orders like he still owned the world. But the truth was that world was already slipping from his grip, and the final push was mine to give. I had brought my real estate attorney, a land rep, and 2 members of the development firm I quietly partnered with. We stood just outside the main gate, far enough not to draw attention, but close enough to survey everything. One of the developers, a guy named Leon, pointed toward the southeast corner and asked, "So, what's the plan with this old beast?" I didn't answer right away. I looked around at the rusting fences, the dented delivery bays, the faded paint that once screamed industrial pride and now just whispered neglect. I could almost hear Rick's voice echoing out across the yard like he was still king of the goddamn castle. Then I turned to Leon and said, calm as a confession, "Circle the eviction date in red." He blinked like he wasn't sure if I was joking. The others shifted their weight slightly, a little uncomfortable, sensing the edge under my tone. "Red?" he asked. "As red as you can make it," I replied, and that was that. That moment, quiet, sharp, final, wasn't about logistics or development plans or rezoning paperwork. It was about erasing something that had lived in my blood for decades. It was about proving a point I'd been too afraid to speak out loud until that exact second. It wasn't just about owning the land. It was about owning the silence after his voice finally disappeared from it. Later that evening, I drove across town to see my mother. She still lived in the same house where she raised me, a modest 2-bedroom ranch with sun-faded shutters and a stubborn lilac bush that refused to bloom right. She opened the door with that tired look mothers get when they've learned too much about life and not enough about peace. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Rick used to drop off bags of frozen deer meat like he was Santa Claus for blue-collar survivalists. She poured coffee and looked at me the way only mothers can look at their grown sons, like she was trying to see through the beard and the business suit and find the little boy who used to ask her if computers could feel sad. "I talked to your uncle last week," she said after a long sip. I said nothing. "He doesn't know yet," she added, then paused. "About the sale." "I figured," I said, stirring my coffee though I hadn't added anything to it. She leaned forward, arms crossed, voice low. "Mason, you're turning into him. You know that?" I looked up fast. That hit harder than I expected. "No, I'm not," I said, sharper than I intended. "He's cruel. He uses people. I'm just finishing a circle." "You think he wasn't finishing his own circles?" she asked, and I felt my chest tighten like someone pulled a drawstring from the inside. "He made you feel small your whole life." "I know that. But doing this won't make you taller. It just changes who's holding the ruler." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her how much he'd cost me confidence, years, maybe even love I could have pursued if I wasn't so busy proving I was worth something. But all I said was, "He'll be fine. He always is." She didn't answer. Just looked out the window like she was searching for something she lost a long time ago. 2 days later, the eviction notice was printed, signed, sealed. 3 days after that, it was delivered. The courier said Rick opened the envelope in front of 3 employees and went dead silent. Then red in the face. Then loud. He stormed into the leasing office the next morning, demanding answers, waving the notice like a flag on fire. The receptionist tried to calm him down, but you don't calm a man like Rick. You just wait for him to run out of breath. Eventually, the property manager walked him into a glass-walled room with framed certificates on the wall and a copy of The Art of the Deal behind the desk like some kind of shrine. They sat down. The manager opened the file, turned it toward Rick. That's when he saw my name. He didn't read it. He stared at it. Just my name, typed in plain black font across the ownership documents. His face, they said, didn't change. Not for 10 full seconds. Then he stood up, slow and quiet, and walked out of the office without a word. Didn't yell. Didn't throw anything. Just walked out like a man whose entire foundation just gave out from underneath him, and he couldn't quite decide whether it was the wind or his own weight that caused the collapse. And somewhere on my desk at home, a calendar hung with one date circled in red. The knock came early, somewhere between when the coffee started percolating and when the sun managed to lift itself above the rooftops, painting the sky in tired shades of orange and smoke gray. I was still in my undershirt, half asleep, standing in the kitchen of a house I'd bought cash, far from the neighborhoods where Rick's people knew how to pronounce my last name. I didn't have to look through the peephole to know it was him. Some storms you can feel through the walls. He didn't wait for me to open the door. The moment it creaked inward, he shoved it with his shoulder and stepped inside like it was still the 80s and he still had a say in the direction of my life. He was breathing heavy, lips pressed into that tight line he wore when he was seconds from boiling over, fists clenched like they remembered what it felt like to break things that talked back. "What the hell is this?" He barked, waving a crumpled copy of the eviction notice, corners greasy from his hands, ink smudged like it had been clutched all night. "Is this some kind of goddamn joke?" I didn't move from the kitchen, just picked up my coffee cup and took a sip. "Morning, Rick. Can I get you something? Water?" Humility. He stared at me, wild-eyed, face flushed and jaw trembling like a man who suddenly realized the ground wasn't under his boots anymore. "You bought the land. Behind my back. You went around me. You were never in front of me," I said, walking over to the kitchen island, placing the cup down with deliberate calm, the kind of calm that only comes when a man has nothing left to fear. "You rent. I buy. You talk. I build. You remember yelling at me on my 16th birthday about how I'd never make it unless I learned to work with my hands? Well, I did. These," I held up my fingers, callus-free and steady, "built something bigger than your steel-tooth machines ever could." He slammed the notice on the table, hands spread, shaking. "You've been planning this. For how long?" "Long enough," I said, and he knew I meant it. "I didn't need you to approve. I needed you to not see me coming." His eyes narrowed like maybe he was starting to realize just how long he'd underestimated me, how deep that mistake now ran, like cracked concrete in a foundation he thought was solid. "You're destroying my life's work," he said, voice cracking on the edge of fury and something softer. "Panic, maybe. You think that factory just runs itself? You think those men in there are numbers on a spreadsheet? They've got mortgages, kids, medical bills. This isn't just about me." And for a moment, I hesitated. Because behind all that bluster and rusted pride was a truth I couldn't ignore. He was right about them, if not about himself. The factory wasn't just his ego monument. It fed families. It paid for braces and Christmas presents and gas tanks scraped to empty. I knew their names, some of them. I remembered playing tag with their kids at company picnics when I was young enough to still believe Rick had something noble inside him. But then I remembered the nights I cried myself to sleep because he'd laughed in my face in front of everyone, calling me princess because I didn't want to join his tool shop summer program. I remembered how he told my mother I needed toughening up after he saw the robot I built out of scrap computer parts. I remembered the way his words felt like fists, and how nobody ever stepped in, least of all him. "You could have given me a call," he said, voice lower now, like the fire had died down but the smoke was still thick. "You could have warned me, given me time. That would have been the decent thing." I stared at him for a long second, then walked to my office and pulled out the formal agreement I had prepared, already notarized, already waiting for this moment. "There's another option," I said, sliding the folder across the table like a closing argument. "I'll let you stay on the land. Keep operating. But it's under my name, my terms. Your lease becomes a licensing agreement. You're a tenant in the empire I built." His hands didn't move. He just stared at the paper like it was a snake waiting to strike. "You want me to kneel," he said slowly. "No," I said. "I want you to accept that the world changed while you were busy yelling at it. You don't have to kneel. But you do have to step aside." He stood there, quiet for a long time. Then he picked up the folder, glanced at the first page, and closed it. "You win," he said, not with anger, not even with bitterness, but something worse. Resignation. He laid the folder back on the table, untouched, and turned toward the door. He paused with one hand on the frame, didn't look back, just said, "Real men don't beg." And I replied, softly, "Real men know when it's time to stop fighting battles they already lost." Then he was gone. No slam of the door. No curse thrown over his shoulder. Just gone. And I stood alone in my kitchen, holding a coffee cup that had long gone cold, wondering why the hell I didn't feel better. The factory shut down on a Thursday morning under a flat, colorless sky, the kind of sky that makes even steel look tired. No sirens, no fireworks, no last-minute protest. Just a slow grind to stillness, as machines gave their final hiss and workers carried their lunchboxes to pickup trucks that suddenly looked heavier. The echo of the last shift punching out sounded more like a funeral bell than anything mechanical, and when the last garage door groaned shut, it was like someone had taken a deep breath and decided never to let it out again. I didn't go there that day. I stayed home, sat at my desk, watched the silence settle through emails and notifications that had nothing to do with Rick or the factory or the people whose lives had bent around that place like vines on rusted chain link. By Saturday, he was gone. Nobody had heard from him. No calls. No angry voicemail. No last stand at the gates. Just silence. Like he'd vanished into the very smoke he used to breathe with pride, as if the man had folded in on himself and disappeared. A few of his guys tried to reach out, said he left early the morning after our talk. Someone said they saw him at a diner 2 towns over, staring at a black coffee like it owed him answers. My mom didn't talk to me for a week. My cousin Janine said I was heartless. Said it didn't matter if Rick was a bastard, he was our bastard. Said family meant something. I wanted to ask her if family meant humiliation, too. If family meant hearing your dreams laughed at until you stopped saying them out loud. But I didn't. I just let her walk away, red-faced, voice shaking like she'd swallowed a mouthful of shame and couldn't spit it out. The house was quiet now, too quiet. No congratulations came in the mail. No champagne from investors. I didn't expect applause, but I hadn't expected this. It was like winning the final round of a fight only to find out the crowd had left during the intermission. I walked the property a week after the shutdown, alone, pushing open the dented front gate with a booted foot. The place smelled like rust and oil and memory, the kind that sticks to your skin even after you've scrubbed it raw. I walked the halls, stepped over bolts and crushed soda cans, ran my hand across the cold spine of a lathe machine that probably hadn't been used in months. And then I found the photo. It was lying in a dusty office drawer near the back, behind a broken stapler and 2 unused safety goggles. I don't even know why I opened that drawer, but when I did, the thing just stared back at me. A photo of me at 8, skinny arms, nervous eyes, oversized glasses. I was holding a little plastic computer toy, the kind you buy at Walmart for $50 and call it educational. Rick stood behind me, one hand on my shoulder, pushing, not resting, pushing me toward a workbench saw like he was trying to shape me into something I hadn't asked to become. I took that photo and went home, cracked open a bottle I'd been saving for something that felt more like celebration than this. I drank alone, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at that photo like it held a secret I hadn't noticed before. And maybe it did. Maybe the secret was that even back then I knew he'd never see me. Not really. Not the way I wanted. I wanted him to see a builder, a creator, someone who could take chaos and turn it into structure, just like he claimed to respect. But to him, wires and code were invisible. They didn't clang. They didn't burn your skin. So, they didn't count. Sometime around midnight, buzzed and blurry, I called the bank. Not for anything specific, just to ask. A question had crept in that I couldn't shake. Did he try? And it turns out he did. Rick had mortgaged his house 3 months before the land went up for sale. Tried to get a private loan. Pitched it as a buyback move, some last hurrah to preserve the factory's future. But the bank declined. His credit was shot, his assets weak, and the value of the land had been slipping for years. He tried to fight back, but he lost before he even started. I bought the land before he knew he was in a war. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at nothing. And I thought about how much time I'd spent trying to prove something to a man who never asked me to, who didn't want me to succeed if it didn't happen in his way. I thought about how I used to dream of this moment, of owning the land beneath his feet, of watching him look up at me from a place of defeat. But now that I had it, now that I stood in that spot, I wasn't sure what I'd built was a throne. It felt more like a tomb. The next morning, I put the photo in a drawer and closed it. I didn't throw it away. Some part of me still couldn't let go. And maybe that's the real cost of the crown. Not the money, not the land, not even the loneliness. It's the fact that after everything, after all the silence, the distance, the perfect revenge, I still wanted him to turn around one day and say, "You did good, kid." But he never would. And that silence echoed louder than any machine in that factory ever did. Maybe I didn't buy the land to win. Maybe I bought it to bury the past. Trouble is, sometimes the past doesn't stay buried.